The $12 were in a tobacco tin on the mantel. I knew exactly how many times I'd counted them because I'd scratched a little mark in the wood each time, the way a man in a cell marks the wall. 7 marks. 7 mornings I'd stood in the cold kitchen and lifted that lid and looked at what was left of a year's work and told myself it would be enough. It wasn't going to be enough. The cattle were down to 11 head. I'd sold the rest in October at a price that made the buyer look away when he shook my hand, which told me everything. The fence along the north pasture had 3 sections down since the October blow, and I hadn't fixed them because fixing them meant the cattle might wander out there, and I couldn't afford to lose a single one to the canyon drop. So I left the fence broken and moved the herd south and told myself I'd get to it. My name is Caleb Marsh. I'll tell you that up front because the rest of this is easier if you know who's talking. I was 44 years old that winter, which isn't old unless you've been working the same piece of ground since you were 19 and the ground has been winning. The ranch was called the Double M, which my father named it, and I never changed because it seemed like bad luck to rename a thing you were already losing. 800 acres of mixed grass and pine and one creek that ran cold and clear until July, when it slowed to something you could step across. A good place, a hard place, mine. The nearest town was Garnet, 11 miles east on a road that turned to mud paste in November and stayed that way until March. There were 40-some people in Garnet if you counted the Haverson boys, which most didn't because they came and went. A dry goods, a livery, a post office that shared space with the barbershop, a saloon that didn't have a name on the sign because Hector Prout, who owned it, said a man looking for a drink doesn't need a sign to tell him what he's looking at. I went to Garnet that December morning for flour and lamp oil, and to drop off the payment on the note I owed the land bank, which was held by a man named Aldous Crane who had moved out from St. Louis 4 years prior and set up as a banker and money lender, and had the look of a man who had studied how other men smiled and then practiced it in a mirror. The note payment was $6. That would leave me $6, and whatever I could pull from the land before spring, which in December is nothing. I had the tin in my coat pocket. The wagon needed a wheel looked at. The left rear was wobbling on the hub in a way that made a sound like a question every half mile. I told myself I'd ask Denny Prout at the livery to look at it and not fix it, just look, because looking was free. That's the kind of calculation a man makes when he's down to $12. The road into Garnet runs along a cut where the hill's pressing close on the south side, and there's a place where a stand of old cottonwoods grows right up to the edge, big trees, the kind that have been there since before anyone in the territory was born. I came around that bend and saw the wagon stopped in the road. It was a small rig, a 2-horse team, and one of the horses was down in the traces. Not dead, I could see its head moving, but down on its front knees and not getting up. The other horse was standing still with its ears back, the way a horse stands when it's scared but too tired to run. A woman was in the road beside the down horse. She was trying to get it up, one hand on the bridle and one hand on the horse's neck, talking to it in a low voice I couldn't hear yet. She wasn't panicking. That was the first thing I noticed. She was working the problem the way you work a stuck gate steadily, without wasted motion. I pulled up and set the brake and climbed down. She looked at me, not afraid, not relieved. She just looked, taking measure. "Shoe," she said. "He threw it somewhere back on the grade and came down wrong. I think the leg's all right, but he won't stand on it." I crouched down and ran my hand along the horse's foreleg. She was right, no break, no bad swelling, just a stone bruise on the sole where the shoe'd been. The horse flinched when I pressed the frog but didn't cry out, which was a good sign. "He'll stand," I said. "He just needs a minute and some convincing." "I've been giving him minutes." "Then let's try the convincing part." I got my shoulder under his neck and she took the bridle and we worked him up slow. He came to his feet favoring the leg, but he stood. She ran her hand down his nose and he pushed into her palm, which told me she knew horses and the horse knew it. I looked at the wagon for the first time. It was loaded furniture, crates, a rocking chair tied to the side with rope that someone had tied carefully, the knots even, a bed frame, a butter churn, the kind of load a person makes when they're moving everything they own and they know it and they've decided that what they're taking is exactly what matters and nothing else. "You're moving," I said. "I was moving," she said. "Now I'm stopped 11 miles from where I'm going with a lame horse on a road that turns to river when it rains. It's not going to rain today." She looked at the sky the way people look at the sky when they've learned not to trust it. "No," she said, "probably not." Her name was Ruth Alding. She told me that when I asked, straight and without hesitation, the way a person tells you their name when they've got nothing to hide and no reason to be anything other than what they are. She was a widow. Her husband, a man named George Alding, had been running a small farm 12 miles north of Garnet, and he died in September of a chest sickness that came on fast and left fast in the wrong direction. She'd held on through October, tried to make the numbers work, and then stopped trying when she understood the numbers weren't the problem. The problem was that the farm had been in George's name, and George's brother, a man named Curtis who lived in Cheyenne, had sent a letter through a lawyer saying the property was his by right of inheritance and she had 30 days. She'd taken the 30 days and packed the wagon. She was going to Garnet to stay with a woman she knew there, a Mrs. Fenton, who ran the boarding house and had written to say there was a room. The room cost $2 a month. She had $9. I didn't ask her all of this at once. It came out in pieces while I unhitched the lame horse and tied him to the back of my wagon, and she climbed up on her seat, and we drove the rest of the way into Garnet slow, my wagon leading, her following with the one good horse. It took an hour and a half. She didn't talk the whole time, just when I asked something, she answered it, and the rest of the time she watched the country, which is a thing I respected without being able to say exactly why. Denny Prude at the livery took the lame horse and looked at the foot and said he could shoe him by end of day, which was going to cost $1.50. Ruth Alding listened to this and nodded and didn't flinch, but I could see her doing the arithmetic the same way I'd been doing mine all morning. I said I'd cover the shoeing. She looked at me. "I don't need that," she said. "I know you don't. I'm doing it anyway." She studied me for a moment in a way that wasn't gratitude and wasn't suspicion. It was more like she was filing something away. Then she nodded once and went to find Mrs. Fenton's boarding house. I went to see Aldous Crane. His office was in the back of the dry goods, through a door that had been added after the original building was up, so the frame was slightly off and the door never hung quite right. He had a desk that was too big for the room, and a painting of the Missouri River on the wall that he'd brought from St. Louis, and that had nothing to do with anything in this territory. He stood up when I came in, which was something he did for everyone, a habit of courtesy that sat wrong on him like a coat borrowed from a bigger man. I put the $6 on his desk. He counted it without picking it up, just moving the coins with one finger. Then he looked at me. "Mr. Marsh," he said, "I've been meaning to speak with you." That sentence, in my experience, has never preceded good news. He had a piece of paper on his desk that he turned toward me. The note, my note, the one I'd been making payments on for 3 years. He pointed to a clause in it, a thing I'd signed and not fully read because the man who'd held the note before Crane had been a different kind of man, and the clause hadn't mattered. The clause said that the lender, upon determination that the collateral property was in material decline, could call the full balance due within 60 days. "I've ridden out," Crane said, "last month to have a look." I hadn't known that. He hadn't asked permission, and I hadn't been home when he came, apparently, and he'd come and looked, and now he had a determination. "The fence," I said. "The fence, the herd count, the condition of the outbuildings." He folded his hands on the desk. "I understand times have been difficult." He said that the way a man says it, when he doesn't understand and isn't trying to. The full balance on the note was $212. He was giving me 60 days. I walked out of that office and stood in the street for a while. The cold was particular that day, not wind cold, just still and gray and deep, the kind that sits in the ground and works up through your boots. I stood there and looked at the mountains to the west, which I'd been looking at my whole life, and which looked the same as they always did, which was not comforting and not cruel, just there. The double M was going to go to Aldous Crane in 60 days. I went to the dry goods and bought flour and lamp oil and a tin of coffee, because I decided if I was losing everything, I was at least going to lose it drinking decent coffee, and I drove home. I want to tell you something about that winter that's hard to explain if you haven't lived it. There is a particular kind of freedom in having nothing left to lose. I don't mean that as a hopeful thing. I mean it plain. When a man drops past a certain point of worry, the worry stops working the way it's supposed to. It stops making him careful. I'd been careful for 3 years, rationing and calculating and making the same dollar do the work of 2, and I was still going to lose the place. So the calculation stopped. I fixed the fence, all 3 sections by myself in 4 days, working in the cold until my hands didn't feel the wire anymore. I moved the herd back north where the grass was better. I patched the roof on the barn where it had been weeping in the rain. I split wood until I had enough stacked for 2 winters, not 1. None of it made sense economically. I was not going to save the ranch by fixing its fence, but I found I couldn't stop. There was something clarifying about working the land when it wasn't going to matter. I could see it straight for the first time in years, what it was, what it had always been. A good piece of ground that a man had worked his whole life and was proud of even now. I went to Garnet twice in December, and once each time I saw Ruth Aldine. The first time she was coming out of the dry goods with a parcel and she stopped and we talked for 10 minutes about nothing much. The weather, the condition of the road, whether Denny Pruitt's lame horse had fully recovered. It had. The second time she was sitting in Mrs. Fenton's parlor when I stopped in to drop off a letter. Mrs. Fenton had asked me to carry back from the post office on my way through, and we sat across from each other for maybe 20 minutes while Mrs. Fenton made tea and talked about her sister in Denver, and I was aware the whole time of Ruth Aldine sitting still and quiet the way a person sits still when they are very tired and very tired of showing it. In January, I found out about Curtis Aldine. I found out the way you find out things in small places, through the accumulation of small pieces that other people don't think are connected. Denny Pruitt mentioned that a man from Cheyenne had been asking around about Ruth Aldine's situation. The postmaster, who talked too much but was honest about it, said he'd received an inquiry about property in the area. And then Hector Pruitt at the saloon, who was Denny's uncle and not related to Denny in temperament at all, told me flat out that Curtis Aldine was coming to Garnet in February, and that he had a buyer for the Aldine Farms equipment, which he'd already sold before his brother's body was cold, and that he was also trying to determine whether there was anything Ruth had taken with her that he might have claimed to. The rocking chair. I thought about the rocking chair tied to the side of her wagon with those careful knots. I rode to Mrs. Fenton's the next morning. Ruth Aldine answered the door herself, which meant Mrs. Fenton was out. She looked at me, and at whatever was on my face, and stepped back to let me in without asking why I'd come. I told her what I knew. I told it plain, the way I'd want to hear a thing like that, without softening and without dramatizing. She sat at Mrs. Fenton's kitchen table and listened, and when I was done she was quiet for a moment. "He has no claim to what I took," she said. "I took what was mine, what I brought into the marriage and what George gave me and what I earned. I know that, but a man with a lawyer and money can make a claim out of nothing, and it costs you to fight it even when you're right." She looked at the table, then at me. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Marsh?" I didn't have a clean answer to that. I'd ridden 11 miles in the January cold on a horse that needed new shoes. I couldn't afford to tell a woman something she deserved to know, and I hadn't thought much past the telling. But I was there, and she was looking at me, and so I said the thing that was true. I'm suggesting that when Curtis Aldine comes to Garnet, he's going to find that Ruth Aldine has people, and that people with something to say about how she's treated are going to say it. She looked at me for a long time. "You don't have anything to spare for this," she said. "I can see that, Mr. Marsh. I could see it the day we met." "No, I don't." "Then why?" I didn't know how to explain it. There was the conscience part, the plain fact that what Curtis Aldine was doing was wrong and I couldn't watch it happen. But there was something else underneath that, something that had to do with the way she'd worked that lame horse on the road without panicking, and the way she'd listened to Denny Prute's price and done the arithmetic quietly, and the way she sat at this table right now looking at me without any performance of helplessness. She was a woman who'd been given a bad hand and was playing it straight, and something in me that had been running low for a long time responded to that like dry ground to water. "Because it's right," I said. She nodded slowly, not accepting charity, accepting a fact. Curtis Aldine came on a Thursday in the second week of February, which was also the day I found out that Aldous Crane had sold my note to a property company out of Denver, which was a thing Crane could do under the terms of the note, and which meant my 60 days had become 45 because the Denver company had its own timeline. I found out about the Denver company in the morning. Curtis Aldine rode into Garnet in the afternoon on a hired horse, which told me he'd come by stage to the nearest railhead and then hired local, which meant he hadn't planned to stay long. He was younger than I expected, 35 maybe, with the hands of a man who worked in an office and the voice of a man who'd learned to use it to get what he wanted in rooms where the getting was done with words. He went to the saloon first. Everyone new to Garnet went to the saloon first, and by the time I walked in, he'd already introduced himself to 3 people and explained that he was here on family business and that his late brother's wife had unfortunately removed certain items of property that rightfully belonged to the estate. I got a whiskey I couldn't afford and stood at the bar. Hector Prute was watching me. He was a man of few words who chose them with precision, and he poured my whiskey and said quietly, "You know what you're doing." "No," I said. He nodded as if that was the right answer and went to the other end of the bar. Curtis Aldine was explaining to 2 ranchers who were barely listening that the law was clear on inheritance and that he had documents. He had a way of saying the word documents that made it sound like a natural force, like weather or rock. When he ran out of ranchers, he looked around the room and found me looking at him and came over. "Don't believe we've met," he said. "Caleb Marsh, Double M Ranch, northwest of here." "Curtis Aldine." He shook my hand with a good grip practiced. "You know my brother's widow?" "I do." Something shifted in his expression, small and quick, recalculating. "Then maybe you know she has some of my family's property in her possession." "I know she has her property in her possession." He smiled, the kind of smile you put on to keep from showing what's underneath it. "The law may see that differently." "The law isn't here," I said. "I am." That landed. He looked at me the way men look at each other when they're deciding how far a thing is going to go, and I looked back, and what I had that he didn't was that I wasn't afraid of how far it went. I was losing my ranch in 45 days. I had $12 in a tin on my mantle and an 80-year-old horse and 11 head of cattle and not much else. There was a freedom in that, the same freedom I'd found splitting that wood alone in December. A man who's already been ruined doesn't have much left to protect except his own account of himself. Curtis Aldine left Garnet the next morning without going to see Ruth Aldine at Mrs. Fenton's. I don't know what the full calculation was in his head. Maybe he had a lawyer but not a strong case. Maybe he looked at Garnet and decided it wasn't worth the trip twice. Maybe Hector Prout said something to him that evening that I wasn't there to hear, because Hector Prout was that kind of man. Whatever it was, he left, and the rocking chair stayed where it was. I told Ruth Aldine the next day. She was in the dry goods when I found her, looking at fabric. Not buying, just looking, the way you look at things you can't afford but like to see. She turned when I came in and I told her Curtis Aldine was gone. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you sleep at all last night?" "Some." "You look like a man who spent the night deciding something." She wasn't wrong. I'd lain in the cold of my own house and listened to the wind work at the eaves, and looked at what I was going to say to her, and looked at it from all sides, and then set it to the ceiling until I had it right. "I'm going to lose the ranch," I told her. 45 days, give or take. I've known it was coming, and I've known for a while there's nothing I can do about it. She didn't say she was sorry, she just watched me. "What I have left is the work," I said. 45 days of good work. And what I'd like, what I'm asking, because it's a question and you can say no, is if you'd consider coming out and seeing it before it goes, before I have to walk off it. I don't want the last person to see it properly to be Aldous Crane or some man from Denver. She looked at me for a long time. "You want me to see it," she said. "I want somebody to see it who knows what they're looking at." Something moved across her face that wasn't pity. It was closer to recognition. I can't say it better than that. She came out on a Saturday in the middle of the month, driving her one-horse rig on her own, and I walked her around the whole place. The creek first, where the ice had started to pull back from the edges, and you could see the water moving under, and the south pasture where the grass was already thinking about spring, and the barn with its patched roof, and the neat split woodpile, and the repaired fence running straight along the north property line. I showed her everything the way a man shows a place he's proud of, not the way he shows a thing he's selling or defending. This is the spring that doesn't dry up. This is the corner of the north field where the soil is different, darker, 3 times better than anything else on the place. She walked the fence line with me and didn't say much and looked at everything carefully. At the end, we stood at the rise above the creek and looked back down at the house and the barn and the mountains going white and clear to the west, and she said, "You fixed all this in December." "Most of it." "Knowing you were going to lose it." "Yes." She was quiet for a while. The wind moved through the dry grass below us, and the cattle were spread out in the south pasture, small and dark against the pale ground, and the house had smoke coming from the chimney that I'd lit that morning more for her visit than for myself. "George would never have done that," she said. "He'd have stopped. He'd have said, 'What's the point?'" I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. She turned and looked at me. Her face was clear in the cold light, not performing anything. She'd ridden 11 miles in February to look at a dying ranch with a man she barely knew, and she was looking at him now the way she'd looked at the lame horse that first day, taking measure, arriving at something. "What would you do," she said, "if you could stay?" "Work it, that's all, just work it." "That's all it takes sometimes," she said. "Somebody who'll keep working it." She put her hand on my arm then, not the way a woman does when she means to comfort, but the way you put your hand on a fence post to feel whether it's solid, testing. And then she left her hand there, which was an answer to its own question. The 45 days were interesting ones. I won't dress that up. What happened was this. Ruth Aldine came back to the Double M the following Saturday and the one after that. She brought food the third time, a pie and a jar of put-up tomatoes, which she left on the table without making a ceremony of it. She'd grown up on a farm herself in Missouri, and she knew which work was which, and she helped with it the way a person helps when they've decided to and not before, which is the only useful kind of help. She talked to Aldous Crane. I didn't ask her to and didn't know she was going to until it was done. She sat across from him in his office with the Missouri River painting on the wall and asked him to show her the terms of the note and the clause about material decline. and she asked him, with the note in her hand, when exactly he had ridden out to make his determination, and what specifically he had observed, and whether he had, at any point, ridden out again after that to observe the current condition of the property. He had not ridden out again. She pointed out that the clause allowed a determination based on current condition, not past condition, and that she would be happy to arrange for him to ride out immediately if he wanted to make a fresh assessment. I don't know exactly what Crane said. Ruth told me about it that evening sitting at my kitchen table with the lamp between us, and she told it flat and without triumph. What she said was that Crane had looked at her for a while, and then said he supposed a current assessment would be the appropriate standard. He came out the following week. He wore a coat that was wrong for the cold and boots that were wrong for the mud, and he walked the fence line with his hands in his pockets and looked at the cattle count and the repaired outbuildings and the woodpile that was stacked to the eaves. He didn't say much. He accepted the cup of coffee I made him and drank it standing by the window looking at the barn. He said he'd need to review his determination. His review took 3 weeks. What came back was a letter saying that based on current assessment the material decline clause did not apply, and the note would revert to its original payment schedule. I sat with that letter for a long time. I wasn't going to pretend I'd saved the ranch by fixing a fence and splitting wood. Ruth Aldine had walked into a banker's office and taken his own document apart in front of him, and that had saved the ranch. I knew that, and I wasn't going to make it something other than what it was. I rode to Garnet the day after the letter came. It was March by then. The road was still bad but passable, and the cottonwoods at the cut were starting to show the first pale green at the tips of their branches, the color that comes before the leaves, the color that is pure promise and not yet fact. Ruth Aldine was in the dry goods when I found her, which seemed right, as if she'd been there all along and I'd just been slow to arrive. I told her about the letter. She nodded. I know, Crane told Mrs. Fenton. I owe you the ranch, I said. You owe me a cup of coffee, she said. You had $12 and a piece of ground and you kept working it. I helped you make someone look at the work, that's all. She was being practical about it, which was her nature, and I loved her for it then in a way I didn't have a word for yet, the way you love a thing that is exactly what it is and nothing else. Ruth, I said. Caleb, she said. That was the beginning of the real conversation, which took until summer to finish but which had already decided itself, I think, on that rise above the creek in February, when she put her hand on my arm and left it there. She moved out to the Double M in June. She brought the rocking chair, which fit on the porch facing west, and she put it there, and I put mine beside it, and we watched the light go off the mountains that first evening in a silence that had nothing empty in it. $9 she'd had. The boarding room at Mrs. Fenton's had cost her 4 of them by then, and she'd spent another $1 and some on food and thread and a new pair of gloves. I still had the 6 that were left from my 12 after the shoeing and the lamp oil. Between us, we had $11 and some cents, and a ranch that was still technically mine on paper, and still technically going to require $212 in payments over the next 3 years to remain that way. That's where we were. I want you to know that because I'm not going to tell you it was easy from there. It wasn't easy. The work was the same work it had always been, and the notes were the same notes, and the winters were the same winters. We lost 2 cattle the following winter to a cold snap that came without warning. The creek ran low in August and scared us. The roof on the house needed more than patching by the 2nd year, and the patching took a week that neither of us had to spare. But we had each other's account of the work, which I hadn't known how much I'd been missing until I had it. To have someone see what you've done in a day, not praise it, just see it, is a thing that keeps a man in his own skin. She knew what it took to run the north fence in the cold. I knew what it took to put up a winter's canning alone. We knew what we were each carrying, and it made the carrying lighter. Not lighter the way unburdened is lighter, but lighter the way balanced is lighter. Like a load shared across 2 shoulders finds its center. There's an evening I think about. Late September of the second year, the air just turning. I'd been out all day and I came back at dusk and she was on the porch in her chair with her hands in her lap and the mountains going pink and purple beyond the barn. And she looked up when I came around the corner of the house and the look on her face was she was glad I'd come home. Not relieved, not performing gladness. Just a woman looking at a man she'd chosen and being glad it was him. I stopped walking. She said, "Get cleaned up, supper's on." I went in and cleaned up. But I stood at the basin for a minute with the cold water on my face and thought, this is what it was. This is what all the work was for. Not the ranch, not the note, not the cattle or the fence or the wood stacked to the eaves. This. A woman who chose this place, and chose the man who came with it, and who sits on a porch at the end of a hard day, and is glad when he comes home. That's the whole of it. Everything else is just the land you work to earn the right to call it yours. The tobacco tin is still on the mantel. Empty now, has been for a while. I keep it there because I can, which is a reason that makes more sense to me now than any reason I could have given you when I had $12 in it and 7 scratch marks in the wood. Some mornings I stand in the kitchen in the early light and look at it, the way I used to look at the coins. And I think about that winter, the man I was then with his careful calculations and his broken fence and his 11 head and his slow, precise, daily accounting of what was left. He wasn't wrong about the arithmetic. He was wrong about what he was counting. Ruth comes in while I'm standing there usually. Gets the coffee going, doesn't ask what I'm looking at. She knows. And she sets a cup in front of me without a word and stands beside me for a minute before she goes about the morning, her shoulder against mine, the two of us looking out the window at the frost on the ground and the light coming up cold and clear over the ridge the way it does this time of year. That's how a day starts when you've done something right, not easy, not settled or solved or finished, just right, just a man who kept working his land and a woman who saw the work and called it what it was. The tin's empty, the ranch is ours,